What will you discover at Luray Caverns? From the tippy tops of their ropes course, breathtaking views of the Shenandoah Valley. From deep down in the caverns, wonder and awe from all the formations built over billions of years. And in the spaces in between, you can walk through history, see the evolution of the automobile, and even meet the mayor of Toy Town Junction. Open 365 days a year. Discover the perfect holiday adventure the whole family will love at Luray Caverns. Plan your trip at LurayCaverns.com.
Today on CityCast DC, Sara Bronin is one of the world experts on zoning. It's the kind of thing that really rivets people at cocktail parties, right? But in fact, Bronin's new book about how zoning shapes our lives, it's like a secret history of how cities came to look the way they do. And it's also a blueprint for the way they can get better. And because she lives in Georgetown, it's full of examples from DC that you don't have to be an urbanism nerd to understand. Today is Wednesday, November 20th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Sara.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
Good. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we actually talk about zoning a lot on our podcast. You grew up in Houston, the only big city in America with no zoning. You were the zoning chief in Hartford, Connecticut, but now you're in Georgetown. You write towards the end of your book that Georgetown's actually zoned pretty well. Why? What does that look like?
So the book you're talking about, Key to the City, aims to prove to readers how important zoning is in creating our places, how key it is. You mentioned me being from Houston, which has no zoning, and I talk a little bit about how that is highly problematic for the city from a functional and even environmental justice perspective. I did chair the city of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission, a city that couldn't be any more different than Houston, a compact, walkable, very historic city with lots of historic assets. And now, as you said, I am in Georgetown. And one of the things that makes Georgetown unique, I guess, if you look at the broad swath of American zoning, is that it allows for dense development. Even though it's a historic district, the zoning allows for both single family and multifamily. It allows for corner stores. It allows for a mix of uses up and down the avenues. And the zoning has evolved over time to move from an industrialized waterfront to a waterfront with a very different mix of uses, including offices, embassies, housing, and an awesome park that now helps to manage the stormwater response from Georgetown when it comes to flooding in the Potomac River. So I think for me, the question in the book is how can we enable through zoning more options for housing than we allow now? And how can we enable as one option the creation of neighborhoods like what I consider to be a pretty vibrant mixed-use neighborhood that is, for many, unattainable because of the high prices. And the high prices, to me, speak to the desirability. And again, the question there is, why doesn't zoning allow more of this?
So a lot of people would look at Georgetown and think, well, this is all sort of fairly organically happened, right? You've got some stores on big streets. You've got some nice houses on the side streets, people walking around. When we stopped doing industrial stuff along the river, they turned those buildings into other things. But what you're saying is that in a lot of the country, maybe even in a lot of this region, that would not have been allowed under the law.
So in lots of places where there is zoning, you have a large swath of land that is devoted only to one type of use and only to one type of development. And I would say that that is the large lot, single family housing zone. What that means is that cities all over the country, suburbs, rural areas, all of the local jurisdictions that have zoning tend to allocate the highest proportion of their land to what I would consider a one-size-fits-all zoning. So they'll say, for example, you can build a house, but you also have to have an acre of land before you build it. That results in sprawl. It results in communities that are pretty spread apart. It results in places that people can't get around in without a car, can't meet their neighbors, can't access conveniences, the kinds of things that make neighborhoods great. Now, I'm not saying we should never have those kinds of developments, but unfortunately, zoning, as it's been adopted in these local governments across the country, only allows those kinds of developments. And so I'm saying in my book, we really should consider shifting the balance, and you do that predominantly through zoning changes.
So a lot of people would look at that set of facts, right? That around the country, you've had all these sort of places which were subject to zoning that said you can only build houses here, you can only build apartments there, you can only have offices there. And it's resulted in this sprawl. It's resulted in sort of desiccated big cities. It's resulted in all kinds of things people think are pretty bad. A lot of people would look at that set of facts and say, you know what, the zoning thing is a bad idea. We shouldn't have done it at all. But you are actually making a different argument in your book.
So I start the book in the first chapter was really standing in front of the multifamily development where I lived when I was born and spent the first few years of my life. I describe in this city without zoning what I saw, which is a gas station, a strip mall, a nightclub, and a self-storage facility. How do those types of uses make sense across the street from a place where I lived, where there were lots of other families and older people and people going about their lives? Those are not the kinds of things that if you were designing a vibrant, fulfilling community, not to mention a beautiful physical landscape, that you would choose. You just wouldn't choose that. Zoning is necessary because it helps to smooth out those juxtapositions that really shouldn't be there for a variety of reasons, whether they're environmental or public health or quality of life type reasons. Houston is, to me, makes the case for zoning by not having zoning. So I'm not one of those people who says zoning should be abolished. I think we should have zoning, but we should really rethink it fundamentally, and we should reshape it to ensure that it's meeting our needs and desires.
To come back to Georgetown for a second, if Houston has no laws whatsoever on zoning, that has meant that the market does not create the sort of adequate thing opposite that apartment building. It hasn't created sort of corner stores or bigger groceries you can walk to, or any of the things that I think you would say are more appropriate uses than the strip mall and the self-storage facility.
Well, I think because in a place like Houston, these are all businesses. So just say commercial property owner can buy a piece of property and say, well, I just decided I'm going to put it right here. They're not necessarily thinking about what's best for the neighborhood. Somebody who's operating a self-storage facility is not thinking, does this meet the aesthetic and convenience and other needs of the community immediately? They're looking at it and saying, this lot is within X number of miles from X number of people. It's the cheapest lot. It meets my criteria, and I'm going to buy it. In the absence of zoning, individual property owners are making decisions based on a wide variety of factors that may not include the best interests of the community surrounding them are. And so that's where I think zoning can help play a role in mediating those values in response to more specific community conditions than a single property owner might take into account in citing, in that case, a self-storage facility.
I love our talk about ways zoning could be improved in DC, elsewhere, has been around creating a kind of walkability. Walkability you see in Georgetown, you see in a few DC neighborhoods, but not in all DC neighborhoods. And it's certainly what I like personally. But why is it a thing the city or society through its government should aspire to?
Walkability is a really important goal for a variety of reasons. First of all, as I kind of alluded to, it enables people to have convenient access to transportation or neighborhood retail or services like haircuts and barbershops, doctor's offices. But having a walkable community to me means having easy access to a variety of uses. It also means that people are healthier because they can choose to walk instead of driving all the time. In addition to walking, the community might be more amenable to supporting options like bicycles. It also means great benefits for the small businesses that locate in these neighborhoods. When somebody can just pop in on a bike or on foot to patronize a shop, You see in those communities much higher revenues than in those places which are only accessible by car. So I do think that, from an economic standpoint, from a quality of life standpoint, from a public health standpoint, having walkable environments really is a win-win on a lot of different levels.
Have you ever tried a squid ink margarita? What about a cotton candy old-fashioned? DC's bartenders are constantly raising the bar with wacky and delicious new cocktails. And what better way to try out their creations than during this year's Cocktail Week? This year's celebration is running Friday, November 29th through Thursday, December 5th, the 91st anniversary of Repeal Day. Whether you like a classic martini or a mixologist's strangest specials, DC Cocktail Week has something for everyone, with over 100 participating locations in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Warm your belly this fall with special happy hours and tasting events from some of DC's best restaurants. Visit dccocktailweek.com for details. That's dccocktailweek.com. Cheers.
Let's be real, lawsuits are not fun, but with Paulson & Nace, at least they're a little easier. Paulson & Nace is a DC law firm in every sense of the word. It was founded here in 1979. Partner Chris Nace is a local who cares deeply about the DC community, even serving on the board of the local branch of the Living Classrooms Foundation in his free time. Nace and his associates Samantha Peters and Maya Perry handle medical malpractice, wrongful death, and other complex injury cases. And they don't just settle every case. They'll go to court. They'll fight for you. Paulson & Nace has even been recognized as one of U.S. News' best law firms. So if you have been hurt or lost a loved one because of someone else's mistake or negligence, call Paulson & Nace for a no-obligation consultation. Visit www.paulsonandnace.com. That's PAULSONANDNACE.com. Or call 202-463-1999. So you're in DC. Tell me, what are some of the changes that you have seen and learned from that you think could be applied here to make our system better?
DC is really interesting because it has actually been doing a lot of thinking about zoning. I will say that for a place that has so much land devoted to federal government buildings, the city is doing well to think about changing that 9-to-5 neighborhood feel that you get in much of what people say is the downtown of DC to something more like a 24/7 approach. Sometimes when zoning changes happen in places where there already is existing development, so just using downtown DC as an example, you do see barriers, not necessarily through zoning, which can be changed, but in the buildings that already exist. So lots of these buildings that were created for office workers, which have unfortunately post-COVID been emptied out, have to be repurposed on their ground floors and inside to meet, let's say, a housing use, which is the most logical conversion for a lot of these buildings. In order to do that, of course, that requires a developer who's going to spend the money to do that. And they need to understand, what the building code requirements will be, what changes they can make. They need to understand the market. So there's a lot of other things that are happening in DC and the changes that have been considered. If you look, though, especially in Northwest DC and places beyond those areas, you don't see a lot of multifamily housing. You also don't see a lot of mixed-use zoning in the north central parts of DC. So, DC could continue to refine and look at its map and see how its zoning text and map work together to produce the outcomes we want.
It's an interesting contrast you're raising. One is the idea of adapting to the country's changing work habits by turning chunks of downtown into a more residential, more 24-hour neighborhood. And in that case, even if they did every zoning change that you could want, there still is the sort of basic cost of you've got this incredibly expensive piece of real estate, an office building, and you have to do this very expensive thing to it to turn it into residential, even if that can be done. But in the north central part of the city, I think what you're saying is that the zoning itself, rather than these other costs, are part of the reason why you don't have, say, a lot of mixed-use developments or a lot of multifamily housing, which is one of the reasons housing is so expensive here.
You're right that, different neighborhoods have different zoning particulars and consequences. And that's one of the things I do try to draw out in my book. So going from post-industrial cities. And in their case, the need to attract new growth. That is a contrast, by the way, to DC, which is seeing a lot of people who want to live here and lots of growth. It's a matter of accommodating the demand. In another project, I have a tool called the National Zoning Atlas, and DC is up on that map. It's at zoningatlas.org in case any of your readers want to take a look at it. Our map shows that 92% of land in DC is zoned to allow for single-family housing. If you toggle to apartments, you can see 34% of DC actually allows for multifamily housing. DC has a lot more allowance for multifamily housing than some cities. The question, I think, for DC is what other restrictions? So it's not necessarily just the allowance. It's also things like the height requirements, minimum lot sizes, Florida area ratios, minimum unit sizes, and those kinds of things that work together in zoning codes across the country to constrain the number of units that might eventually be built. Oh, I should add, by the way, minimum parking requirements. That's one thing that I do talk a lot about in the book.
And that's been sort of the questions of more parking, less parking has been a very contentious issue in the district. Where does that stand in our zoning codes, and what do you think optimal practice would be?
12% of land in DC allows multifamily housing, but has a minimum parking requirement. And you can see right here on the map, the vast swath of places where there is a minimum parking requirement is the downtown, as well as the avenues leading northwest and actually northeast as well. So these places are actually exactly the places that are well served by transit, that are walkable, and yet we are imposing on developers the requirement, especially if they're in downtown, that they build a parking garage to house cars for potential residents of these units that are legal in zoning. Essentially what you're saying is, you're a developer, you want to convert an office building to housing. Sure, you can do it, but you've got to build an underground parking garage. So how much does that cost? $100,000, $200,000 a unit, maybe depending on where you are. Then you're adding that on to the cost to the renter, because the developer is not just building the garage and not passing that cost on. It's part of the development cost. What you're doing is you're making housing more expensive. You are building infrastructure that arguably doesn't need to be built in a city with so many transit options, in a city that is pretty walkable. I think you are eroding the quality of the built environment when the priority is to build space for cars. In some cases, you're building a studio apartment. If you have a 2-space minimum parking requirement, the parking might take up more space than the studio apartment. That's crazy.
And it's crazy also because we're in a city where elected officials tell us that affordable housing is the single biggest priority. And you're talking about a set of rules that goose the prices in ways that make it very hard to build housing for middle-class people.
Exactly. And we have seen cities around the country that have eliminated their minimum parking requirements. Those are the kinds of technical details that are buried in these hundreds of pages long zoning codes that make a huge difference on the city's growth. But you have seen cities that have eliminated their minimum parking requirements. And guess what? They're functioning just fine, and arguably seeing development that is much more compatible with the surrounding neighborhood, that is much less expensive when it comes to housing, and that doesn't result in paving over huge swaths of the city. So it's a win-win for everybody, but you have to believe that if a developer really thinks that there's going to be a residential tenant in downtown DC that wants a car, they'll build that parking. But for the zoning code to require it, it's a mismatch between regulations and reality.
So besides the parking requirements, is there anything else in terms of zoning laws that you would like to change for DC?
I think I would just point to some of the areas that we are still trying to figure out how to equitably redevelop, how to add density. The industrial parts of DC that are no longer industrial probably deserve to continue to see some scrutiny and some attention, because we have seen in other cities places that have successfully rezoned industrial areas for a broader mix of uses to the benefit of the communities. And I'll say, too, accessory dwellings are pretty prevalent in Washington. That's the kind of low-hanging fruit type reform that advocates for housing have advocated at the local and state levels. In DC, according to our map, about 79% of the city does allow for accessory dwelling units. Those are the granny flats, the in-law suites that you can build on the same lot as a single family house.
Which helps people afford houses. But why isn't that 100%?
I think it's not 100% because the areas which don't allow an accessory dwelling unit are those areas which also allow for multifamily housing. So actually, if you look at downtown, downtown is zoned to not allow accessory dwelling units, probably because the people who wrote the zoning code pretty much assume that no one's building a single family house downtown. The neighborhoods that allow single family houses to have accessory dwelling units, and those are all over the city and all over what I think statistically and demographically are the higher income neighborhoods. So I don't think that difference between the 79% and the 92% is necessarily that detrimental.
So here was my question with the sort of bigger conclusion of your book, which, if I'm characterizing it correctly, is that we ought to have zoning, but it ought to be smart and ought to like keep up in real time with what we need as a society and as a democratic self-government. You know, in the last 10, 15 years, DC has really tried to grapple with some of these things that you have pointed out are zoning that has terrible impacts on cities across the country. We've tried to add bike infrastructure, largely successfully, but not always, change parking rules. So this is, at the neighborhood level, often brutal, and there's so much resistance. I live up Connecticut Avenue, and the politics of the bike lane are just vicious. I think people are more afraid of what they'll lose than drawn to what they might gain. Cities, counties, governments have a pretty strong disincentive to changing anything in their zoning because the politicians are worried about making people mad. Do you think it's realistic to expect municipalities to be willing to reopen these codes with greater frequency? Or is it whatever we write now is going to get stuck the same way whatever we wrote in the 50s got stuck?
I think that once people understand that zoning has a huge effect on everything around them, they get interested in it really quick and they become more amenable to changing it. That was the playbook that we used in Connecticut after serving as chair of the Hartford Planning and Zoning Commission. I started a statewide organization that's still going out there without me, that was really aimed at honing in on the zoning issues and exclusionary zoning in Connecticut. I also see right now huge shifts in politics. The Yes in My Backyard movement is giving me a lot of hope. There's chapters at the state and local levels, as well as national organizations devoted to expanding housing supply and doing it in ways that are really smart. That makes me very optimistic. I think at the local level, that's where you really see the biggest opportunity, but that's where you see the no in my backyard contingent saying, you know, not here, not now, we don't want this, it's going to change the character of our neighborhood and all of the arguments that you hear. We provide opportunities for people to come out and object to new housing through public hearing requirements in zoning codes. That brings out some really unfortunate sentiments in people who may not be informed about issues, not only factual issues related to new housing, because that's really what they're protesting. Mostly it's new housing. Sometimes it's commercial stuff, but a lot of it is new housing. From the factual perspective, they're usually wrong about their fears. But we've set it up so that essentially people who are trying to do the right thing, zoning regulators, decision makers, city council people, are getting yelled at consistently by their neighbors. That is a really tough place to be in. That's why I feel like with the growth of the YIMBY movement, getting people to those hearings has been a good strategy. You've seen that in New York City with groups there, including Open New York. You've seen that in other places across the country. I guess I would just say looking at when we get public input, at what stage is it most appropriate, is something that zoning reformers should definitely look at. I do question whether doing a project by project public hearing is preferable than setting the rules out in advance and having a staff of experts, the staff planners, actually administer the code. My bias is that let's write the rules as the community wants to see them and let the staff who has expertise in these issues actually go out and execute and implement it. So, that's something that public hearings, another aspect of zoning codes that might, if we look at that and we put those in the right places, might actually reduce the level of vitriol that we see at some public hearings.
But the counter argument, I guess, would be that the lack of any scrutiny, the lack of opportunity for public input characterized this era when Robert Moses and so on could just bulldoze whole neighborhoods without anybody having a say.
Zoning doesn't allow for demolition at scale. It doesn't accommodate eminent domain. It is a lot by lot regulatory tool, because the only way that zoning codes end up applying is if there's an application to do something on a lot. I think the public scrutiny helps improve the overall regulatory regime when it comes at the level of writing the rules, of writing the zoning code. What's our rule for avenues? What is our rule for nodes and squares? What is our rule for the areas around transit? And then once those rules are set, once they have the particulars of the way that the developments are going to go, the buildings are going to be sized, where they'll be located, then that's the point where the staff can say, we've got it from here, rather than to subject every new application to another round of reviews. So I don't think it's a lack of scrutiny. I think it's just, where is the scrutiny best placed? Where is a community best served? Some of the more divisive discussions can be had in the earlier stage rather than the later stage.
What's the anecdote or the story or the scenario you use to hook people into how important it is over their life?
Well, in the book, I start with the story of a neighborhood activist in Hartford who I walked around the city with, her neighborhoods. And, me being a land use professor at that time and still a property law professor, I'm very familiar with the way zoning codes are written and what they might do and all the research. She was walking around her neighborhood, having served on various public boards and chairing her neighborhood advisory commission. We looked at the fast food places, the strip mall, the gas stations and car washes, all of these things that had replaced beautiful historic buildings on the avenue. And it hit me. She didn't realize that zoning was behind all of this. She was telling me, well, here's the issues that we have. Speeding cars, too much asphalt, our neighborhood is too hot, there's not enough trees. I had the smells of the Popeyes coming into my yard. And again, smart person who had been active in her community for years. And I thought, oh my gosh, like many people around the country, it seems, a committed person to her neighborhood didn't really realize that everything that she saw was written into the zoning code. That was the kind of development that the zoning code, starting in the 50s, 60s, as zoning code changed in Hartford, mandated that kind of suburban style development. That wasn't appropriate for Hartford, which is a deeply historic city, lots of beautiful buildings at scale, 2 to 4 stories, walkable and all of that. So then I started to unpack, okay, so how do I help to change the zoning code and develop a process where people can get educated about what zoning is and then can see how changes might apply to their neighborhood. I feel like I'm supposed to be a translator, the person who knows a lot about the rules and the technical side. How do you translate that for the public? Maybe you're super into zoning, but I bet a lot of people who care about their neighborhood haven't heard about it and don't understand its huge power.
Most of the smart money, most of the smart policymakers have turned against the vision of zoning from the 50s and 60s, highways, cars, et cetera. But here we are at the moment of another big sort of social and economic change. What do you think the future of DC's zoning laws would be, at least if things go well?
I think in general, zoning can be simplified significantly. DC's code is pretty complex. By the way, there's 164 zoning districts in Washington, DC. So how can we simplify zoning to make people better understand it, to align the words on the page with the goals of the community and best planning principles? Then I think you get into some really good conversations about whether we keep zoning codes in the form that they exist now, whether we move to something else. And I think eventually we'll try to propose some kind of way to help standardize the types of districts that communities might consider in terms of their rezoning. So I guess in general, the goal would be simplicity and alignment. And if DC is, which I think it is, continuing to move in that direction, I would just encourage more of that.
Sara, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.